Hey guys, tonight we drift quietly across a mirror of water that stretches farther than your sleepy eyes can see. The sky above glows pink and gold while a cool mist hangs low, wrapping the lake in a soft veil. You hear the faint splash of a paddle breaking the surface, steady, rhythmic, and calm. The boat rocks gently beneath you as you approach the island city of Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec world, and one of the most astonishing places ever built on water. The city rises ahead, shimmering like a mirage. Whitewashed temples glow in the morning sun, causeways stretch out like long ribbons, and canals slice the land into watery avenues. Canoes glide by like quiet taxis carrying baskets of maize, bundles of flowers, or even the occasional annoyed turkey. If you lived here, you wouldn't need Uber, you'd just whistle for a passing canoe. The air is alive with the mingling scents of wood smoke, wet earth, and roasted chilies drifting from household hearths. You probably wouldn't survive this city for long. The altitude alone would leave you huffing and puffing like a tourist on a stair climb, and the diet rich in maize, beans, chilies, and insects would test your adventurous side. Forget your tap water. Here the lake itself is your pantry, your highway, and your bathtub depending on the time of day. As magical as it looks, life in Tenochtitlan takes a strength and rhythm most of us modern folks have misplaced. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It always fascinates me to imagine this sleepy little channel stretching across time zones like invisible canals. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You glide past a long stone causeway lined with merchants carrying baskets balanced on their backs. The causeway feels alive, a ribbon of humanity threading the city to the land beyond. On either side, canoes slide silently, loaded with everything from firewood to geese. Somewhere ahead you hear the ring of a bell, perhaps a priest summoning worshippers to a temple, perhaps just someone announcing that the tamales are ready. Tenochtitlan wasn't just a city, it was a floating wonderland. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, it balanced precariously between land and water like a giant lily pad that refused to sink. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs chose this watery site out of necessity, divine sign, or sheer stubbornness, but the fact remains they transformed a swamp into the beating heart of an empire. You paddle deeper into the city's canals. Narrow alleys of water weave between houses built of adobe and stone. Wooden walkways connect courtyards where families hang chilies to dry while children splash in the shallows, chasing each other with reeds. Ducks quack indignantly as your canoe drifts too close to their nest. It's hard not to notice how seamlessly water and life intertwine here. And here's your first cheeky aside: if you ever complained about mowing the lawn, imagine tending a garden where your neighbor's canoe might suddenly drift into your cornrows. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. The magic of Tenochtitlan lies in its balance. On one side, massive temples rise dedicated to gods of sun, war, and rain. On the other, ordinary households hum with daily chores, grinding maize, weaving cotton, patching nets. The canals carry gossip as much as they carry goods. News of a festival, rumors of tribute demands, or whispers of omens all float down these watery streets like ripples spreading outward. You pause at a wide plaza where traders unload baskets of herbs, flowers, and vegetables. The produce gleams with dew freshly picked from chinampas, those ingenious floating gardens that will soon steal the spotlight of our story. Without them, the city could never have fed itself. With them, it became not only self-sufficient, but dazzlingly green, a checkerboard of islands that seemed to defy gravity. But that's for later. For now, imagine yourself sitting back in the canoe, letting the paddle rest across your lap. The water slaps softly against the wooden hull and the city breathes around you. Dogs bark from rooftops. Fishermen cast nets with a lazy grace. A distant drumbeat rolls across the water, steady as a heartbeat. One quirky tidbit: Tenochtitlan was so laced with canals that Hernán Cortés later compared it to Venice. The comparison makes sense on paper, but you know Venice never had chinampas growing squash blossoms or hummingbirds darting between willow trees. And let's be honest, the Venetian pigeons probably weren't half as entertaining as the Aztec turkeys that strutted around like feathered security guards. The city feels alive, suspended between worlds, part land, part water, part dream. You can almost sense the quiet pride of its builders who turned a marsh into a metropolis. Even now, centuries later, the ripples of their ingenuity still lap against your drifting canoe. You drift deeper into the canals, noticing how the houses press close together, stacked like blocks along narrow water lanes. The city is alive, bustling, crowded, yet every direction you look, it's hemmed in by water. Behind you, the great plaza glimmers with temples, but ahead there's hardly room for another hut, let alone a field of corn. You begin to understand the problem the Aztecs faced: too many people, not enough solid ground. The island of Tenochtitlan was only so big. Sure, it had causeways stretching out like long arms to the mainland, but when your city is growing faster than your shoreline, you need something clever. The population kept swelling. Some historians estimate a couple 100,000 people at its peak, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Imagine the grocery bill. You can't exactly tell your citizens, "Sorry, we're out of room. Please move to the next lake." So the Aztecs looked to the water and thought, if the land can't grow with us, maybe we can make the water grow land for us. This is where their ingenuity shines. Historians still argue whether chinampas, the famous floating gardens, were a purely Aztec invention or borrowed from earlier peoples in the Valley of Mexico. But what's certain is that the Aztecs perfected them, transforming shallow waters into lush green fields that seem to hover like rafts. Picture the need driving this creativity. Every household wants maize beans, squash, and chilies. Nobles expect tribute in baskets of produce. Priests demand flowers for offerings. And everyday folks, they just want tortillas on the table. Without enough farmland, this dream could sink faster than an overloaded canoe. You paddle past a family's home where you overhear them talking about the crowded conditions. Children balance on walkways only a couple of feet wide. Laundry hangs like banners above the canals. Chickens squabble for space on rooftops. From here, the idea of building gardens right on the lake seems less like genius and more like necessity. One quirky tidbit: some Aztec families were said to sleep in canoes tied to their homes if space ran out inside. You imagine rocking gently in a canoe, trying to fall asleep, while your neighbor paddles past, muttering about how loud the frogs are tonight. Comfy, maybe not. But it shows just how precious every square foot of land became. You glance around the lake. The surrounding shoreline looks tempting, but it wasn't much help. Much of the land around Lake Texcoco was salty and marshy, not great for farming unless you enjoy seasoning your crops with brine. This forced the Aztecs to get creative. Instead of pushing outward onto poor soil, they turned inward to the lake's shallows. Historians still argue whether the push for chinampas came more from practical hunger or religious symbolism. After all, the Aztecs saw themselves as chosen to transform the land, bringing order to chaos, just as their gods once shaped the world out of watery nothingness. Floating gardens in that sense weren't just agriculture, they were cosmic landscaping. Your canoe nudges against the side of a wooden platform, and you can almost picture the first moment when someone decided to stake out a rectangle of reeds, pile mud on top, and say, "There, that's new land." It's a small idea at first, but with repetition and care, it grows into entire neighborhoods of green. Here's your gentle joke: somewhere, an Aztec farmer probably tried to explain chinampas to his skeptical cousin, only to hear, "So you're telling me you're going to plant corn on water? Good luck with that." And then a year later, the cousin was begging for a plot of his own. By evening, the city quiets just a little. Torches glow along walkways, their light flickering on ripples. You see the outline of farmers heading back across the lake, their canoes heavy with harvests from these artificial plots. It's here in the hush of night that the scale of the solution hits you. Tenochtitlan didn't just survive on crowded land, it thrived by learning how to make its own. The floating gardens never looked more promising than in these twilight moments, waiting for dawn to bring another day of paddles, mud, and growth. The next morning, mist curls low over the water, and you drift toward the shallows at the edge of the island. Here the lake feels more like a swamp, muddy, reedy, buzzing with dragonflies. This is where the first chinampas take shape, and you catch sight of farmers staking out a rectangle in the water. They jab long wooden poles into the lake bed, marking out a frame as if sketching a garden, right onto the surface of the water. Once the stakes are in place, they weave reeds between them, creating something that looks suspiciously like a giant waterbed frame. Of course, unlike your mattress, this one is meant to hold soil, not Netflix binges. The farmers paddle back and forth hauling baskets of lake mud, piling it layer after layer onto the woven base. With each dump of muck, the thing rises out of the water, transforming from lake to land inch by sticky inch. Historians still argue whether these first chinampas were considered floating in the literal sense. Some believe they were anchored directly to the lake bottom, more like shallow platforms than free-floating rafts. Others argue they may have started as drifting plots before being tethered. Either way, you can see the genius at work: create land where none existed, a patch of earth held together by patience and mud. The work is messy. Your feet would sink knee-deep if you tried to help. Farmers scoop black muck that smells faintly of algae, hauling it in woven baskets. They pile vegetation on top to keep it from sliding back into the water. The smell isn't glamorous, but the soil is rich with nutrients dredged straight from the lake bed. This recycling kept the plots fertile year after year, a kind of sustainable farming system long before modern buzzwords made it trendy. One quirky tidbit: the first builders often tossed old household trash, broken pottery, cracked gourds, and worn-out sandals into the foundation of chinampas, not because they were sentimental about their garbage, but because it added bulk and helped weigh the structure down. Somewhere beneath the soil of those floating fields lies someone's discarded cooking pot, unknowingly preserved as part of history's most unusual garden bed. The farmers add one more critical step: they plant willow and ahuejote trees along the edges of the plot. Their roots sink down through the mud, weaving into the lake bed, locking the whole thing in place. Without them, the chinampa might drift off like a lazy raft, perhaps ending up in a neighbor's yard, with corn stalks waving hello. With them, the garden becomes stable, secure, ready to endure. You sit in your canoe watching as the rectangular patch emerges 30 feet wide, maybe a couple 100 feet long. It doesn't look like much yet, just a muddy rectangle fenced by reeds. But give it time and it will blossom into a green oasis full of maize beans, chilies, and flowers. Here's your gentle joke of the night. Imagine trying to explain chinampas to your landlord. Yes, I'd like to build my vegetable garden on the water, and no, it won't sink. Odds are they'd evict you faster than you could say sustainable agriculture. The Aztecs, though, made it work. The soundscape here is soothing. Paddles dip and swish. Reeds rustle in the breeze. Ducks circle, quacking indignantly at the intrusion. Occasionally, the thud of mud hitting the woven mat echoes across the shallows. It's a steady rhythm, almost hypnotic, like a lullaby written in soil and water. Historians still argue whether chinampas began on Lake Texcoco specifically, or whether earlier peoples in the valley pioneered them first. Some evidence suggests cultures predating the Aztecs experimented with reed rafts. But the Aztecs scaled it up dramatically, creating entire networks of fields that stretched like checkerboards across the water. What might have begun as a humble experiment grew into an empire's backbone. You lean back, letting the canoe rock slightly beneath you. The farmers wipe sweat from their brows, but they smile as the plot takes shape. For them, it isn't just about farming. It's about staking a claim against the limitations of nature. The lake said no, but the Aztecs answered with mud and willpower. By afternoon, the new chinampa gleams dark and wet, ready for seeds. Children scamper across its surface, helping plant the first rows of maize, while women tuck herbs and flowers along the edges. In a city where space is scarce, this little rectangle represents survival and hope. And as you drift away, the water glimmers with dozens of similar plots, each a testament to stubborn ingenuity. From the shore, they look like floating green carpets stitched together into a patchwork that expands the city far beyond its island. They are the quiet magic beneath Tenochtitlan's grandeur, the reason the city could thrive where others might have sunk. The next day, you drift past a chinampa that's already matured beyond the mud and reed stage. Instead of just a rectangle of muck, it bristles with willow trees along its edges, their branches trailing down like sleepy curtains brushing the water. Their roots twist deep into the mud, weaving through layers of soil and reaching all the way to the lake bed. It's as if the trees are quietly whispering, "Don't worry, we've got you anchored." Without them, the whole thing could wobble or wander, but with them, it stands firm, an island as steady as stone. You lean over the side of your canoe and dip your hand into the lake. The water swirls cool around your fingers, carrying flecks of green from floating reeds. This water is both threat and lifeline. Too much rain and the chinampas flood, too little and the mud cracks like pottery. The willow trees and woven reed bases balance the extremes, holding soil in place, so the gardens don't melt back into the water. Historians still argue whether willows were chosen purely for their practical root systems, or whether they carried sacred symbolism, tying earth and water together in the Aztec worldview. Either way, their presence is essential. You could call them the unsung heroes of floating gardens. The reeds themselves play a quieter role. Woven into fences, mats, and platforms, they keep the edges of the chinampas from fraying. Over time, the reeds rot, but farmers replace them season after season, maintaining the rhythm, like someone endlessly mending socks. You watch one man crouch at the water's edge, weaving new reed bundles with deft hands, the pattern as natural to him as breathing. Here's your gentle joke for this stretch. Imagine explaining your anchoring strategy in the modern world. Yes, my entire farm won't float away because I planted a few trees around it. Try telling that to your mortgage lender and see how far it gets you. But in the Valley of Mexico, it worked brilliantly. You paddle further, and now the chinampas stretch in orderly rows, each one lined with trees. From above, it must look like a giant checkerboard, green squares bordered by leafy fringes. Canoes glide through the watery channels between them, farmers steering silently with long poles. It's oddly serene, like drifting through a park designed for dreamers. One quirky tidbit: some chinampas were said to be so well rooted that they fooled visitors into thinking they were natural islands. There are stories of unsuspecting travelers trying to build huts on them only to be politely told, "Sorry, that's actually my cornfield you're stomping on." The line between land and water blurred so thoroughly that only the farmers truly knew where the earth ended and the lake began. The soil itself tells another part of the story. Farmers dredge up fresh mud from canals, piling it onto the plots. The muck is rich, fed by centuries of decaying plants and fish. This recycling keeps the gardens endlessly fertile. It's a quiet loop of sustenance. The lake feeds the soil feeds the crops, and the crops feed the city. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the cycle humming beneath your canoe, steady and eternal. Historians still argue whether the system's efficiency was deliberate design or happy accident. Did the Aztecs know they were creating one of the most sustainable farming methods ever, or were they simply solving a short-term crisis of space? Either way, the results are hard to deny. The chinampas could produce several harvests a year, outpacing conventional fields and feeding thousands. The sun climbs higher, scattering sparkles across the water. Farmers move carefully along the chinampas, their feet sinking slightly into the damp soil. One bends down to plant beans beside maize, practicing the old method of intercropping, letting plants support and nourish each other. Another ties herbs to the base of a willow, hoping the tree's shade will keep them cool. It's all so ordinary yet extraordinary, a system that survives centuries simply because people never stopped tending it. As you glide past, you notice the quiet confidence of the people here. They don't marvel at their gardens the way you do. To them, this is just life, as familiar as tying sandals. For you, though, it feels like a secret whispered across time. You don't need vast plains to farm, just patience trees, reeds, and mud. And so the chinampas hold steady. Anchored by willows, braced by reeds, thickened by layers of fertile muck, they never sink. Instead, they rise as improbable islands, floating yet rooted, fragile yet enduring. You can't help but feel a kind of drowsy admiration for their resilience, the way they hover between two worlds, without belonging fully to either. The morning mist begins to thin, and the sunlight filters down in golden sheets, glancing off the water until your eyes half close from the shimmer. You drift alongside a chinampa, where maize stalks tower like sleepy sentinels, their leaves rustling with each faint breeze. Between the rows, squash vines curl lazily, their broad leaves shading the soil, and beans climb upward, winding around the maize as though the stalks were ladders made just for them. It's the ancient agricultural trio. You've probably heard of maize, beans, and squash, the three sisters. Though in this setting, they feel more like quiet roommates sharing a floating apartment. You crouch in the canoe and watch a farmer tending the plants. He leans in, gently pressing soil around the roots of a young maize sprout, humming a tune that's been sung 1,000 times before. The sound is low, steady, not for your ears, but perhaps for the crops themselves. Some accounts say the Aztecs believed songs and rituals helped the plants thrive. Historians still argue whether this was more spiritual practice or just another way to make farm work less monotonous. Either way, the melody twines through the air like an invisible thread tying human and harvest together. One mainstream fact: chinampas were so fertile they could yield up to 7 harvests in a single year. That's not a typo, 7. In an age when most farming cultures prayed for 1 or 2 successful yields, these floating gardens practically flaunted abundance. Imagine living in a city where the granaries never ran out, where even in lean times the markets overflowed with produce. That stability didn't just feed bellies, it fueled empires. The quirky side of things is more colorful. Farmers didn't only grow food, they often experimented with flowers. Some chinampas were reserved just for blossoms, marigolds, dahlias, and other bursts of color that would later decorate temples, altars, and festivals. You picture one of those flower gardens bobbing gently on the lake, a rainbow floating amid the green, looking less like agriculture and more like an enormous bouquet. If you squint hard enough, it almost resembles the world's first floating flower shop, minus the Instagram account. And because this is the Aztecs, nothing happens without ritual. Farmers sometimes offered little tokens to the gods of rain and fertility, sprinkling maize flour or pouring out a splash of pulque, the mildly alcoholic drink made from agave. Whether the gods appreciated such gestures is up for debate. Historians still argue whether the floating gardens had their own priestly overseers, or if ordinary farmers handled the rituals themselves. Either way, you wouldn't want to forget your offering. Imagine neglecting it and then watching the sky close up like a stingy wallet when you desperately need rain. Not ideal. You notice how each plant complements the others. The maize grows tall, providing a pole for beans to climb. The beans fix nitrogen into the soil, replenishing nutrients that maize would otherwise drain away. The squash sprawls across the ground, shading the earth, keeping it moist and discouraging weeds. It's an elegant system centuries old that modern agriculture still studies and sometimes copies. You can almost hear nature sighing contentedly at the arrangement. Finally, someone figured out how to make us work together instead of competing. Your canoe drifts close enough for you to smell the earthy mix of damp soil, fresh maize, and crushed leaves. It's oddly comforting, like standing in a garden after a summer rain. And here comes the day's light joke. You try to imagine convincing your modern neighbors to let you grow beans, maize, and squash all tangled together in a shared yard. You'd probably get a homeowners association complaint faster than the beans could sprout. Yet here the messy jumble is genius. The farmer waves absently as he straightens up his back, stiff from bending. His canoe is moored nearby, stacked with tools, wooden digging sticks, woven baskets, and a clay jar half buried in wet mud to stay cool. He doesn't seem hurried. There's no rush when your land practically guarantees harvests. Still, every gesture is deliberate, each mound of earth shaped with care. Farming on chinampas isn't backbreaking plowing, it's more like sculpting mud and guiding plants with a gentle hand. And then you remember you've been floating for hours now, lulled by the rhythm of paddles dipping and water sloshing. The rows of maize and squash begin to blur together, the symmetry soothing in a hypnotic way. You wonder if that was part of the charm. The floating gardens weren't just functional, they were meditative. A farmer could lose himself in the repetition day after day and still walk away with more food than he needed. Even the birds seemed to approve. Herons stalk through the shallows, pecking at fish disturbed by the paddles, while ducks paddle between the rows. They too benefit from the system, snatching bugs and nibbling on the occasional fallen kernel. It's an ecosystem disguised as a farm, everyone playing a part. And as you trail your hand once again in the water, you think of the contrast elsewhere in the world: fields cracked under drought or drowned under floods, while here crops floated serenely, tethered to their islands, tended with patience, humming along to ancient songs. The chinampas never really sank because they were never truly meant to be land or water. They lived in the in-between, like the plants themselves, thriving in balance. The day stretches on, sunlight sliding higher and spilling across the wide, glittering lake. The air grows warmer, and you notice the hush of the early morning gives way to more movement: canoes gliding steadily between the long, narrow gardens, voices calling across the water, and the occasional splash as a paddle strikes at just the wrong angle. You're drifting along one of the watery avenues that cut through the chinampas, and from here the gardens look less like farmland and more like a series of enormous green rugs stitched together across the lake's surface. Your canoe noses toward one garden, and the view is suddenly filled with neat rows of maize stalks. The plants stretch upward, their tassels dusting the breeze with fine yellow pollen. The farmer guiding your canoe explains without much flourish, as if it's obvious that maize is the backbone of everything. It isn't just food, it's life. It becomes tortillas, tamales, atole porridge, even drinks. Without maize, the empire would falter. That's your mainstream historical fact for the moment. Maize wasn't just the staple crop of the chinampas, it was the very foundation of Aztec society. But look more closely and you'll see maize isn't the only star of the show. Just below those towering stalks, beans twine upward delicate green tendrils, curling like restless fingers. Their small leaves flutter, and if you crouch near enough, you can spot the tiny white blossoms that promise the pods to come. Beans are sly contributors here, enriching the soil with nitrogen while they grow. The farmer might not know the modern chemistry, but he knows the soil stays richer, the maize grows taller, and the system continues. And sprawled all over the ground like lazy sunbathers are squash plants. Their big floppy leaves blanket the earth, shading the soil so it doesn't dry out under the relentless sun. Every so often, a bright orange blossom pokes out a trumpet, shouting silently across the rows. Later the blossoms will close and plump squash will swell beneath them. Squash may not have the glamour of maize or the quiet efficiency of beans, but it rounds out the family meal, and let's be honest, roasted squash with a dash of chile is enough to keep anyone happy even after a long day of farming. The quirky fact arrives when you notice a patch of bright color at the edge of the garden. It isn't maize beans or squash at all, it's flowers. Marigolds, dahlias, and other blossoms, their petals a riot of reds and oranges and yellows, turn the garden from a farm into a painter's palette. Farmers grew flowers for rituals, for offerings, and for sheer beauty. And sometimes families simply sold them at the markets because even in the 15th century, someone was willing to splurge on a bouquet. It makes you realize that not everything here was about survival. Sometimes people just liked having a little color in their lives. You can't help but laugh at yourself as you imagine a farmer's canoe piled high with flowers, gliding gracefully to market like an ancient floral delivery service. You picture him arriving with a shrug. Here you go, ma'am, 12 marigolds. Don't forget to leave a review with 5 cacao beans. Historians still argue whether every chinampa specialized in particular crops, some devoted to maize, others to beans, flowers, or medicinal plants, or whether most families simply mixed everything together for variety. Evidence points in both directions, leaving the debate as murky as the canals themselves. Either way, the result was abundance. You're surrounded by food in every direction, and it feels a little like floating through a buffet line that never ends. And while you're soaking this in, the farmer dips a clay jar into the water and offers you a cool drink of atole, the maize-based beverage thickened to a creamy texture. It's warm, slightly sweet, and unexpectedly soothing, as if hot cocoa and porridge decided to meet halfway. You take a sip and suddenly maize doesn't feel abstract anymore. It's comfort in a cup, fueling both body and spirit. What's striking is how natural everything feels. You don't see irrigation ditches, hoses, or clunky equipment. The water seeps into the soil from below, feeding the roots directly. Fish dart between the reeds at the edges of the chinampa, and birds swoop overhead. Nothing seems forced. The floating gardens are as much habitat as farmland, sustaining life of every kind. And here's your light joke for this stretch. Imagine trying to float a tomato plant in your bathtub at home, carefully balancing it on a soggy bath mat, and expecting it to yield crops for 7 harvests a year. Odds are you'd get mildew, a very grumpy landlord, and absolutely no tortillas. But somehow the Aztecs figured out how to make it all work, turning lake water and mud into perpetual groceries. As the sun climbs higher, you recline in the canoe, lulled by the rhythm of paddling. The maize sways, the beans climb, and the squash stretches, each doing its quiet part. You feel the abundance pressing in from all sides, not overwhelming but steady, reassuring. The gardens don't shout, they simply grow. And as the canoe slides onward, you realize that's the secret charm of the chinampas. They are both simple and genius, obvious and miraculous, humble yet indispensable. The day presses on, and as the sunlight deepens into the kind of steady warmth that makes your shoulders heavy, you realize farming here isn't just about planting and harvesting whenever you please. The Aztecs lived by rhythms. And those rhythms weren't set by a pocket calendar or a smartphone app. They were dictated by the turning of the sky, the gods, and the ever-present Aztec calendar. You float quietly watching as a group of farmers huddle near the edge of a chinampa, speaking in low tones about when to sow and when to reap. Their voices rise and fall like the breeze brushing across the water, steady and certain. Here's the mainstream historical fact: the Aztec calendar was not one simple system, but two. One was the Shupawali, a 365-day solar calendar for agricultural cycles. The other was the Tonalpawali, a 260-day ritual calendar filled with sacred days, omens, and ceremonies. Imagine trying to manage your planting schedule with two overlapping planners that sometimes disagreed with each other. Historians still argue whether the farmers leaned more on the practical solar year or bowed first to the ritual calendar, but either way, you couldn't just scatter maize kernels on a whim. Timing mattered both for the plants and for the gods. You watch as an elder farmer marks the date by scratching into a piece of bark paper, consulting painted symbols. He points toward the sky, then toward the soil, as if reminding the others maize should be planted in spring after the first rains. Beans in succession squash, spread to shade the roots. And of course, each step is paired with ritual. Before maize went into the soil, farmers offered incense or maize dough figurines to Sentiotl, the maize god. Without such gestures, planting felt incomplete. The quirky fact comes when one of the younger farmers shows you a pouch of dried chili peppers. Not only were chiles a staple seasoning in their meals, they were sometimes planted strategically on chinampas for pest control. Yes, chili peppers, those same fiery things that can make your modern tongue cry for mercy, helped protect crops by deterring hungry insects and perhaps even larger nibblers. You grin at the thought of squash plants shielded by fiery red guards like a spicy security system. And because the Aztec world loved to blend practicality with ritual, the calendar determined more than farming. Entire festivals revolved around planting and harvest. During the festival of Huitzilopochtli, dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god priests climbed mountains to cut sacred herbs and maize stalks, then returned to the city to bless the fields and chinampas. Farmers, meanwhile, sang prayers to call rain. Imagine stopping in the middle of planting season to attend a festival where priests climb a mountain and everyone hopes the gods are in a generous mood. Your crops and your dinner literally depended on divine weather forecasts. Historians still argue whether these rituals were strictly symbolic or whether they directly influenced when planting began. Some scholars think farmers used rituals as convenient excuses to delay planting until conditions were perfect. Others think the rituals themselves set the timetable whether or not the rains had arrived. Either way, the overlap of calendar, festival, and farming meant your life was as bound to ceremony as it was to mud and water. The canoe drifts again, and you catch sight of children on a nearby chinampa. They're helping scatter maize kernels into furrows, their small fingers moving quickly under the watchful eye of an older woman. The family hums together, not hurried, but deliberate, moving in rhythm. It's almost musical. You realize farming wasn't a solitary job. It was communal, tied into the heartbeat of the city itself. Everyone knew their role, and everyone knew the calendar that dictated when those roles shifted. A light joke surfaces as you imagine yourself trying to explain to a modern boss that you can't show up for work because today is not auspicious according to the Tonalpawali. Somehow you doubt HR would be sympathetic. Yet here, ignoring the calendar could mean insulting the gods and risking famine. Talk about a stricter attendance policy. By late afternoon, the air cools slightly and the shadows of the maize stretch long across the water. Farmers pause their work, wiping sweat with the back of their hands, leaning on wooden digging sticks. It isn't laziness, it's respect for rhythm. Work, rest, feast, ritual, all measured by symbols painted on bark and stone. You glance at the steady rows of crops, each at its own stage of growth, and understand this wasn't random abundance. It was a choreographed dance between nature gods and people. And in that dance, the chinampas became more than floating farms. They became floating calendars themselves, recording time in green shoots, blossoms, and harvest baskets piled into canoes. The air cools as the afternoon drifts toward evening, and the lake takes on a softer shimmer, the light fractured into ripples by every paddle stroke. You notice smoke rising in the distance from an altar at the water's edge, and as your canoe glides closer, The low drone of chanting carries over the water. You've stumbled upon a ceremony, one of those countless rituals that stitch the floating gardens into the wider fabric of Aztec life. Here's your mainstream historical fact: the Aztecs didn't see farming as a purely practical act. It was a spiritual duty, part of a delicate bargain between humans and gods. If the gods provided rain, sun, and fertile soil, people were expected to show gratitude with offerings and ceremonies. On the chinampas, farming wasn't just bending over the soil, it was bending toward the divine. The scene before you is vivid. Priests in cotton cloaks trimmed with feathers toss copal incense into clay burners, the fragrant smoke curling skyward. Farmers stand quietly, heads bowed, holding small bowls of maize kernels. One by one, they pour the kernels into the water as offerings to Tlaloc, the rain god, and Xochimilco, goddess of lakes and rivers. The ripples carry the kernels away, scattering them like tiny golden boats drifting into the vastness. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some ceremonies included the offering of tamales wrapped in maize husks, tossed directly into the water. Imagine the gods unwrapping a hot meal as a thank you gift. The idea that your supper could also double as divine tribute feels oddly practical. After all, who wouldn't appreciate a good tamale? Historians still argue whether these rituals were carried out on every small chinampa or only during larger community gatherings. Some suggest farmers performed tiny daily offerings, pinches of maize flour, or drops of pulque poured into the soil, while others think ceremonies like the one you're watching were occasional but highly formalized. Either way, you get the impression that farming without ritual was unthinkable, like baking a cake without turning on the oven. The chanting rises, a rhythmic pattern echoing across the water, and children toss flower petals into the lake, their laughter mingling with the prayers. Marigolds float briefly, their orange blooms bobbing like little suns before drifting away between the reeds. You watch entranced as the water transforms into a patchwork of color and reflection, incense smoke above blossoms, below the line between earth and sky, blurring in the ritual haze. Your light joke here writes itself. You picture yourself tossing offerings into a modern community garden, maybe a burrito or a bag of chips just to keep the kale growing. You suspect the neighbors wouldn't be impressed, and the squirrels would be even less respectful than the gods. As the ritual continues, drums begin to beat, soft at first, then steady, marking the rhythm of the prayers. Farmers sway slightly, not in dance exactly, but in unison, as if their bodies too are part of the ceremony. The sound isn't loud, more of a heartbeat pulsing across the water. You feel it in your chest, subtle but insistent, like the lake itself is alive and listening. After a time, the priests finish their chants and the farmers step back to their chinampas. Work resumes, but more slowly, more reverently, as though every stroke of the digging stick now carries sacred weight. You realize that for them, there is no sharp line between work and worship. Growing food is itself a prayer, and the floating gardens are living altars. Even the animals seem caught in the moment. Herons perch silently on the poles, marking the chinampa corners, and frogs croak from the reeds, as if adding their own accompaniment. The water carries away the petals, the tamales, the kernels, and perhaps in some unseen realm, the gods receive them with approval. By the time the smoke clears, the lake is calm again, the gardens gleaming in the slanting light. You sit quietly in the canoe, lulled by the rhythm of paddles, the memory of drums still echoing faintly. Whether or not the gods truly demanded such offerings, the effect is undeniable. Farming here feels sacred, connected, part of a cosmic cycle, where every harvest is both survival and ceremony. And as your canoe drifts onward, you can't help but wonder if the chinampas themselves would have thrived quite so long without the rituals that kept them not only fertile, but meaningful. The sun is lowering now, turning the lake into sheets of molten bronze, and as your canoe glides forward, the soundscape changes. Gone are the soft murmurs of farmers and the hiss of paddles. Instead, there's a steady, swelling chorus of voices, laughter, and bargaining calls drifting across the water. You've arrived at Tlatelolco, the enormous market that pulsed at the heart of the Aztec capital. If the chinampas are the stomach of the empire, this market is its beating heart, churning endlessly with food, goods, and gossip. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Tlatelolco wasn't just a local farmers market, it was the largest in Mesoamerica, drawing tens of thousands of people daily. Chronicles claim that on especially busy days, upwards of 60,000 people might pass through, crowding the plaza with their voices, their wares, and their feet. Imagine a farmer from a chinampa paddling in at dawn with baskets of vegetables, only to unload them into this tidal wave of humanity. The floating gardens fed the stalls, and the stalls in turn fed the city. The first thing you see is a stall bursting with maize, bright yellow cobs, ground maize dough shaped into discs, and even containers of a toll drink still steaming faintly. The farmer you watched earlier might well have harvested this batch just yesterday. A few stalls away, beans of every shade sit piled in neat little pyramids, black, red, and mottled brown, their earthy scent mingling with the sweetness of roasted squash. The staples of the chinampas have made their way here, transformed into food ready for trade. And then comes the quirky surprise flowers everywhere. Entire stalls stacked with marigolds and dahlias, their petals like miniature suns waiting to be carried home. Some are sold for ceremonies, some simply for decoration. Imagine walking through a bustling marketplace where between piles of chili peppers and stacks of tortillas, you can also buy an enormous bouquet, proof that even in an empire built on tribute and war, people wanted beauty in their homes. The sensory overload is almost dizzying. Vendors cry out their prices, shaking gourds or clapping to draw attention. Shoppers haggle loudly, waving cacao beans, the currency of the day, between their fingers as if flashing a credit card. You pass one man offering a live turkey, its wings bound, gently squawking in protest. Another sells amphibians plucked from the lake, their slick skins glinting in the evening light. Over there, someone hawks obsidian blades, their edges so sharp they make steel look blunt. And yet, amid all this chaos, you notice rows upon rows of quiet vegetables, flowers, and herbs from the chinampas anchoring the market with their familiar abundance. Historians still argue whether the market was strictly regulated by officials at every stall, or if trade was looser, policed only by the crowd itself. Some chronicles insist stern judges sat nearby to settle disputes on the spot, so if you tried to shortchange someone for a bunch of squash blossoms, you might end up in court before lunch. Others suggest the market ran more like an honor system, with everyone simply knowing their role. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. Your light joke arrives naturally. You imagine wandering into a modern supermarket, picking up a head of lettuce, and immediately being put on trial because you tried to pay with expired coupons. Efficiency, sure, but maybe a little too intense. You continue drifting through the market, eyes half-lidded from the swirl of sights and sounds. Children dart between stalls carrying flowers, while older women sit behind reed mats piled with herbs, cilantro, epazote, and others used to season chinampa vegetables into meals. Farmers cluster together, trading tips and gossip as much as goods. And above it all, the city seems to hum, fed by the gardens, sustained by the rhythm of planting, harvesting, and selling. It strikes you then, the chinampas weren't just clever farms floating in the lake. They were arteries feeding directly into this throbbing heart of trade and daily life. Without the endless vegetables, flowers, and herbs ferried across the water each dawn, Tlatelolco's bustle would fall quiet. The empire itself might stumble. And so, as you finally drift away, the sound of the marketplace fading into the distance, you realize that the floating gardens never ended at the lake's edge. They spilled into the plazas, into kitchens, into ceremonies, into the lives of tens of thousands. Their roots stretched further than any willow tree anchoring the soil. They rooted into society itself. Evening deepens, the light softening into violet and copper, and your canoe turns once more into the quieter waterways, where daily life hums along on the chinampas themselves. If the market was a thunderous drumbeat, this is more like a steady lullaby, the rhythms of families, neighbors, and farmers moving through the ordinary tasks that keep the floating gardens alive. You pause by one chinampa, where a family is gathered around a low fire, the smoke curling lazily into the sky. A pot of beans bubbles gently, releasing a savory scent that mingles with the sweetness of roasted squash nearby. Children chase each other along the narrow earthen paths, laughing so loudly you wonder if their parents ever worried about one of them falling straight into the canal. The mother waves a reed mat in the air to keep sparks off the food, while the father kneels nearby, carefully mending the woven edges of the chinampa with fresh reeds. It's not glamorous work, but without constant repairs, the gardens would unravel. That's the mainstream fact here. Chinampas required ongoing maintenance, layering fresh mud, weaving reeds, dredging canals, because they were never finished. They were alive, and like anything alive, they needed attention. And here comes a quirky detail. You notice a boy standing on the prow of a canoe holding what looks like a small fishing net. But instead of fish, he's scooping up floating algae and tossing it onto the garden's edge. His sister follows with a basket, patting the algae down into the soil. It turns out the Aztecs recycled lake scum into fertilizer. Yes, the green gunk you try to avoid on a summer swim was a prized resource here. You chuckle imagining your own face if someone handed you a basket of algae and said, "Dinner depends on this, better get scooping." Historians still argue whether these chores were assigned by strict family roles, men farming, women cooking, or whether everyone pitched in wherever needed. Evidence shows women did far more than cook. They helped plant 10 seedlings and haul produce to market. But sources also emphasize the symbolic role of men as field workers. The truth probably shifted depending on season, circumstance, and how loudly the children complained about chores. As the evening rolls on, you drift to another chinampa, where an old man kneels beside a willow tree whispering softly. He ties a strip of cloth to the trunk, a tiny offering of thanks. Willow trees weren't just anchors holding chinampas together. They carried spiritual weight, seen as guardians of the fields. The sight feels intimate, as if you've stumbled onto a private conversation between farmer and tree. Closer by, a woman sets maize dough onto a flat griddle, flipping tortillas that puff up gently in the heat. She hands one to a child who bites into it eagerly, steam escaping into the cooling air. The tortilla is plain, no salsa, no topping, just maize, pure and simple. Yet in that moment, it feels enough, the entire empire distilled into a warm, round disc. And here's your light joke. You can't help but compare this to your own sad attempts at making tortillas at home, the ones that come out shaped like distant continents instead of circles. The Aztecs would have laughed kindly, maybe handed you back to the willow tree for remedial lessons. Life on the chinampas wasn't all work. As darkness edges closer, you hear music, a hollow flute's breathy notes, the faint beat of a drum. Families gather sitting on reed mats, sharing tamales or squash stews, telling stories that mix history with myth until you can't quite tell which is which. Laughter rises, and the sound of it glides across the water like another kind of offering, one to joy rather than gods. You notice how seamlessly life here blends the practical with the poetic. Fixing a canoe, dredging a canal, cooking beans, these are chores. But they're also the quiet architecture of an empire, the scaffolding that holds everything up. The chinampas were not isolated farms. They were homes, communities, kitchens, schools, and playgrounds. To live here was to live balanced between land and water, between labor and leisure, between survival and celebration. By the time the stars prick open across the night sky, you realize the floating gardens never slept entirely. Canoes still pass occasionally, torches flickering at their bows, carrying goods to late markets or neighbors. Somewhere another farmer tends a fire, warming his hands after a long day. And you, rocked by the gentle lap of water against the canoe, feel the rhythm of daily life settle into your chest, slow and steady, like the chinampas themselves, never finished, never still, yet always floating, always there. Dawn arrives again, soft and silvery, and you watch the chinampas wake up as if they are stretching their leafy arms toward the horizon. The farmers are already at work because the floating gardens run on schedules tighter than your morning alarm clock. And unlike you, they don't hit snooze. You spot a man bent low, carefully weeding rows of maize, while a woman scatters ground chili onto her cooking stone for the day's meals. This isn't just routine, it's ritual, a choreography that ties body, food, and spirit into one seamless flow. Mainstream fact: first chinampa farming was incredibly productive. The soil was rich with nutrients from dredged lake mud, which kept maize, beans, and squash growing year after year without exhausting the land. Aztec records suggest these gardens could yield up to 7 harvests annually, enough to support millions of people. That's not just gardening, that's agricultural sorcery. But here's a quirky tidbit that catches your eye. Farmers sometimes decorated their gardens with flowers, not just for beauty, but to attract hummingbirds. Tiny jeweled birds zipped across the canals, sipping nectar and pollinating plants. The Aztecs believed hummingbirds carried the spirits of warriors who died bravely in battle. Imagine that your tomato patch doubling as a ghostly veterans hall. You laugh softly, wondering if your backyard geraniums might also host some chatty spirits, just less glamorous ones. Historians still argue whether the chinampas were exclusively state-controlled farmland feeding the empire's elite and temples, or whether families managed them independently. Archaeological finds point both ways. Tribute records show central oversight, but household artifacts found along the edges suggest private family-centered farming. Perhaps like most things, it was both a dance between imperial taxation and family autonomy. As you drift along the canals, you notice how the farmers use long poles to stir up lake mud, hauling it onto the gardens in dripping, dark clumps. The muck looks messy, but it's a secret ingredient. When layered with reeds and decaying vegetation, it builds a spongy, fertile soil that resists erosion. You watch a boy smear it onto the garden edge like icing on a cake, though admittedly one you wouldn't want to eat. And here's your light joke: watching the mudslinging reminds you of family reunions where instead of building up fertile ground, people just fling metaphorical dirt at each other. At least the Aztecs put theirs to good use. But productivity wasn't the only focus. You catch sight of a man walking slowly along the canal bank, scattering flower petals into the water. This isn't farming, it's offering. The Aztecs believed fertility depended not just on human labor, but divine favor. Gods of maize rain and the earth herself were thanked with gifts of flowers, incense, or sometimes drops of blood. The chinampas were temples as much as fields, and life wove around these cycles. Children carried baskets of herbs, women kneaded masa into neat tortillas, elders sat by willows weaving mats that would later patch a neighbor's garden. Even the animals joined in. Dogs, mostly small and hairless, scurried around, sometimes raised for food, sometimes as companions, sometimes for ceremonies. Chickens hadn't yet arrived from across the ocean, so turkeys strutted noisily through the fields, instead gobbling at anyone who got too close. You can almost hear them plotting, "Forget sinking chinampas, the turkeys will overthrow us all." You notice how everything is layered labor, ritual, family, nature. It isn't just farming, it's farming braided with meaning. The Aztecs didn't separate daily chores from spirituality. To them, planting maize was a prayer, dredging canals was devotion, harvesting squash was a conversation with gods. And while your own daily chores might not feel divine, unless laundry detergent counts as a holy relic, you can sense the rhythm that kept these gardens alive for centuries. As the sun rises higher, the hum of life intensifies, hose scraping, earth voices calling across water, the slap of paddles moving canoes between gardens. Each sound is an instrument in a vast orchestra, all playing one song: survival, sung in harmony with beauty. And in this harmony you find yourself drifting, lulled again by the balance of it all. The chinampas were never just floating gardens. They were symphonies of soil water work, and wonder and empire's heartbeat echoing quietly across the lakes. The lake shimmers like polished glass, and you spot ripples spreading outward as foreign sails slice the horizon. Canoes still glide past with baskets of squash and beans, but now there's something new: wooden ships bristling with strange rigging, their sails bright against the Mexican sky. The chinampas don't notice maize keeps growing. Willows keep anchoring, but you can't help staring at the men who've come to stare back. Mainstream fact here: when the Spanish conquistadors first arrived in the Valley of Mexico in 1519, they were stunned by what they saw. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of their chroniclers, described Tenochtitlán as more dazzling than anything in Europe, with broad causeways, bustling markets, and endless canals lined with floating gardens. To men used to Spanish farms and dusty fields, the chinampas looked like sorcery land that floated crops, that flourished water that shimmered between. Here's a quirky tidbit: some conquistadors thought the chinampas might actually be islands that drifted on their own, pushed around by lake currents. Imagine their surprise when they stepped onto a floating field and realized it didn't budge an inch. One Spaniard supposedly tried to pull up a tree at the corner of a chinampa, thinking it was just stuck in a raft, only to find roots dug deep into mud. You can almost hear the Aztec farmers chuckling quietly at the stranger's confusion, like watching someone poke your inflatable pool toy, only to realize it's concrete. Historians still argue whether the Spaniards admired or dismissed these gardens. Some accounts gush about their beauty, while others suggest the Europeans saw them as primitive curiosities. What's clear is that their arrival changed everything. Tribute demands shifted, warfare spread, and the steady rhythm of maize and beans began to clash with the roar of muskets. Yet in this moment, you drift beside them, watching the conquistadors paddle awkwardly in borrowed canoes, nearly tipping over as they try to balance in narrow channels. The locals glide past effortlessly, offering vegetables for trade. You smirk. It's like watching someone try to parallel park a car for the first time, while the regulars weave in and out without breaking a sweat. Still, curiosity lingers. Spanish notes describe how chinampas stretched for miles, green ribbons stitched together by canals. They were so abundant that from a high vantage point, it looked like the whole lake had been quilted into farmland. The newcomers couldn't fathom how an empire had flourished without horses, without iron, without European plows, yet here it was producing enough food to feed hundreds of thousands. You imagine the sensory overload. The scent of flowers wafts from fields of marigolds destined for rituals. Canoes heavy with chilies, amaranth, and maize crowd into docks like floating grocery stores. Drums echo faintly from the great temples in the distance. And through it all, the Spaniards gape, scribbling notes, perhaps already dreaming of how to bend this abundance to their will. Your light joke here practically writes itself. You realize that the conquistadors must have felt like tourists in a high-end supermarket wandering through produce aisles they didn't recognize, trying to figure out if the spiky green thing is edible or decorative. Spoiler, it's probably both. But the encounter was more than a culture clash, it was a turning point. You sense the tension in the air, as if the chinampas themselves can feel the weight of history pressing down. Farmers keep working because maize won't plant itself, but glances or sharper voices lower. The balance that kept gardens steady begins to tremble, though for now the willows still hold fast. You lean back in your canoe, letting the sun warm your face. For a moment you let yourself imagine how it must have felt to arrive in such a place, strange, dazzling, overwhelming. A city on water with fields that never sank and a people whose gardens looked like floating miracles. And you realize the Spaniards weren't wrong to be astonished. Even now, centuries later, drifting across these canals, you still are. The sun is higher now, glinting off the canals until they almost blind you, and you finally lean in close to understand the quiet secret behind the chinampas, why these floating gardens never sank. From a distance, they might look like rafts of reeds or mats drifting lazily, but when you step onto one, the ground is firm beneath your feet, the soil springy but steady, as if nature itself has stitched together earth and water into something permanent. Mainstream fact first, chinampas weren't rafts at all. They were artificial islands constructed by staking out a rectangular plot with wooden posts, weaving reeds between them, and then layering lake mud and decaying vegetation until the platform rose above the waterline. Over time, willows and ahuejote trees were planted at the corners. Their roots reached deep into the lake bed, anchoring the whole garden like giant natural nails. This clever blend of engineering and ecology kept chinampas from drifting or sinking. But here's the quirky tidbit you notice: farmers didn't just let nature handle the job. They played mud delivery service. Using canoes, they dredged muck from the canals and layered it on top, constantly refreshing the soil. It was like topping up your compost bin every few weeks, except instead of kale stems and coffee grounds, it was lake goo and rotting reeds. You almost wrinkle your nose, but then you realize without that muck, no tomatoes, no squash, no endless rows of marigolds. Sometimes the messiest things keep life afloat. Historians still argue whether the willow trees were chosen purely for their root strength or for symbolic reasons. Some suggest the trees were sacred, linking water and sky, while others insist it was simply practical. They grew fast, tolerated wet feet, and could be harvested for firewood or building material. Either way, they turned flimsy mud platforms into gardens strong enough to last for centuries. You crouch down, scooping a handful of soil. It's dark, rich, crumbling between your fingers, and you notice tiny shells glittering in the sunlight. These are remnants of aquatic life, proof that chinampa soil was constantly renewed by the lake. A farmer nearby chuckles at your fascination and says the earth is like a sponge. It drinks in water, keeps crops alive through dry spells, and holds its shape even when storms thrash across the valley. And here comes your light joke. You imagine ordering this kind of soil at a modern gardening store. Excuse me, do you have Lake Bottom Deluxe fortified with ancient fish bones, preferably delivered by canoe? Somehow you doubt your local hardware store carries that brand. But the genius wasn't just in construction, it was in maintenance. Farmers constantly dredged canals, piling muck onto the chinampas, keeping them both fertile and above water. The canals in turn stayed open for canoe traffic and the dredging prevented silting. It was a self-sustaining cycle where water mud plants and humans worked in rhythm. Left alone, the system might have lasted forever, or at least until someone invented skyscrapers in the lake. Standing here, you realize these gardens weren't fragile at all. They were resilient, tougher than stone buildings in earthquakes, more adaptable than hillside terraces. Even after floods, the chinampas held. The secret wasn't magic or luck, it was balance, constant tending, and a little help from those willows. As you drift back into your canoe, you feel the stability under your feet one last time. Not floating, not sinking, but suspended in harmony, half garden, half lake, and entirely ingenious. And you wonder if that's the true secret, not that they never sank, but that the Aztecs never stopped caring for them. The air feels heavier now, as though the lake itself is sighing under the weight of change. You drift through canals that are quieter than before, their once busy lanes now silted with neglect. Canoes still pass, but fewer of them, their paddlers weary, their baskets lighter. The chinampas, once endless ribbons of green, begin to look patchy, like a blanket fraying at the edges. Mainstream fact: after the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlán, the chinampa system began to decline. The conquerors drained parts of the lakes to build new streets and plazas, reworking the watery city into something more familiar to European eyes. With the water receding, many chinampas dried out, their careful balance disrupted. The great productivity that once fed hundreds of thousands faltered. A quirky tidbit you notice along the way: some farmers tried to adapt by raising ducks and fish in the shrinking canals, turning water into ponds for food rather than transportation. You watch children toss handfuls of maize into the water, ducks flapping noisily as they chase it. It's inventive, even charming, but it's no match for the sprawling demands of a colonial capital. The ducks might be loud, but they can't compete with maize. Historians still argue whether the Spanish intentionally dismantled the chinampas to weaken indigenous power, or whether the system simply collapsed under new demands and diseases. Some say colonial authorities saw chinampas as obstacles to European-style farming, while others suggest the empire's fall created too much social disruption to maintain them. The truth probably floats somewhere between neglect and strategy, as so much of history does. You paddle further and notice that canals are clogged with weeds, their surfaces broken by fallen branches. Farmers dredge less often, their energy diverted to paying tribute, building churches, or simply surviving epidemics. Without constant care, the self-sustaining system falters. The willows remain stoic at the corners of chinampas, but even their roots cannot hold back the slow retreat. Here's your light joke: you think about how your own houseplants look after a week without water, drooping, sulky, glaring at you as if they're planning a mutiny. Now imagine that multiplied by an empire. The chinampas were never built to survive apathy. Like your ferns, they needed steady love. And yet not everything is lost. Some gardens remain vibrant, tended quietly by families who cling to the old rhythms. Their maize still rises tall, their beans still climb, their squash still blossoms yellow in the morning sun. You see a grandmother bent over rows of amaranth, her hands steady her song, soft as if she's telling the earth we're still here. The city above shifts and expands, but down on the water, a few chinampas endure, stubborn as ever. They may be fewer, but they carry memory like soil carries roots. Each reed mat, each layer of mud whispers the story of what was once the empire's greatest triumph. You let your canoe glide to a stop. The silence is deeper now, broken only by the call of a bird and the splash of a fish. The decline of the chinampas isn't just about land or crops. It's about balance, lost rhythms, broken voices fading. And yet you sense they are not gone, only waiting like seeds beneath the soil, ready for someone to care again. The afternoon light softens into gold, and you find yourself floating into Xochimilco, one of the few places where the chinampas still breathe today. Painted boats, trajineras, drift lazily down the canals, their decks bright with flowers and laughter. Families gather with picnic baskets, musicians strum guitars, and the water reflects it all like a patient mirror. It's a carnival of sound and color, yet beneath the celebration you sense the quiet endurance of something ancient. Mainstream fact: Xochimilco is a UNESCO World Heritage Site precisely because these surviving chinampas are among the last living fragments of Aztec agricultural genius. Even now they produce vegetables and flowers for Mexico City, though on a much smaller scale. Farmers plant lettuce, herbs, and marigolds, and researchers study how chinampa methods could inspire sustainable farming in a changing climate. Here's a quirky tidbit you can't help smiling at. The canals are home to the axolotl, a rare amphibian that looks perpetually cheerful with feathery gills waving like party decorations. Locals call it the water monster, but really it's more like an underwater muppet. The Aztecs once considered axolotls sacred, tied to the god Xochitl, who supposedly transformed into one to escape sacrifice. You watch a fisherman scoop up a bucketful, the little creatures blinking at you with serene, sleepy smiles, as if they too approve of bedtime storytelling. Historians still argue whether modern Xochimilco is a true continuation of Aztec chinampas or more of a cultural revival for tourism. Some say the ancient techniques survive only in fragments. Others argue the spirit of the system balanced productivity. Beauty is still alive in the daily work of local farmers. Either way, you drift through it as if stepping into a living time machine. A boat passes loaded with bright plastic chairs and coolers of soda, and you chuckle at how the ancient and modern share the same waters. The canals once carried tribute maize to emperors. Now they carry mariachi bands belting love songs to weekend picnickers. You imagine the Aztec farmers peering out from history, scratching their heads, wondering why anyone would pay to float around drinking lime soda instead of hauling baskets of beans. Still, there's something enduring here. You watch a man dredge dark mud with a wooden pole, layering it carefully on the edge of a chinampa, just as his ancestors did. The smell of earth rises sharp and damp, unchanged across centuries. The willows at the corners still spread their roots deep into the lake bed, their leaves shimmering in the afternoon breeze. You realize that despite conquest, neglect, and modern chaos, the floating gardens never truly sank. They adapted, they transformed, they survived. And now, as your canoe drifts slower, your eyelids too begin to droop. The hum of traffic from distant Mexico City fades, replaced by birdsong, water rippling, and the faint strum of a guitar carried on the wind. The chinampas stretch before you like soft green pillows, an empire's heartbeat still steady under layers of time. Wind down begins here. You let yourself breathe slower, longer, as though syncing with the rhythm of the canals. The air feels cooler now, carrying the gentle perfume of marigolds and damp earth. Your boat glides silently, rocking just enough to remind you that water holds you steady and safe. The laughter of picnickers fades into the distance, leaving only the whisper of willows brushing the sky. The floating gardens seem to blur into one continuous green dream, where maize leaves rustle like lullabies and flowers nod quietly in approval. Even the axolotls tucked into their watery homes seem to smile as they drift, their gills waving with each sleepy ripple. You realize the gardens never sank because they were never just soil and water. They were care, patience, and rhythm kept alive by hands that refused to stop tending. And as the day softens into dusk, you too are tended by this story, wrapped in its calm persistence. Your thoughts slow, your body settles, and the canals cradle you like a blanket. The floating gardens are still here, and so are you, drifting gently toward rest.